Hey everyone, welcome to today's webinar where we're going to be talking about 3 simple steps to close a sales deal. I'm super excited to get into some of this content and what we're planning on covering. I'm super excited about what you're actually going to learn as well. But before we get started, let's get some housekeeping items out the way. We'll start with some introductions. I'm Dane. I was born and raised in South Africa. I am a HubSpot Academy professor. If you're familiar with HubSpot Academy at all, you will know or you would have seen me in the Facebook marketing course, the social media certification, the online sales training, and more recently, the how to close a sale lesson that I co-authored with Patrick. So before we continue, Patrick, do you want to give us an introduction and tell viewers and listeners a little bit about who you are?
Yep, the name is Patrick Michael O'Neill Downs. I'm the Sales Enablement and Training Manager at PandaDoc by day, podcast host, and mental health advocate by night. And I just recently escaped from a hair metal band to join you today.
Great. I'm loving the getup. Thanks for that, Patrick. As I mentioned, we have a jam-packed agenda to get through today. Let's take a quick look at what we're going to be covering. So we'll split our conversation and webinar up into 3 very specific sections. The first is building a business case with metrics throughout the sales process. The second is a personal favorite of mine, and that's confirming your champion. And then the third is a hot topic, which I'm sure a lot of people have questions about and opinions on, and that is using time-based incentives throughout the sales process. Does that sound good to you, Patrick? We're ready to rock and roll?
Oh, it sounds so good. I'm so ready to rock and roll, Dave.
Okay, let's do that. See what we did there? All right. So before we get started, Patrick, this is something that we talk about in the lesson that we created. And just as a reminder, for anyone who's interested in that lesson, you can find a link in the description below to the lesson. But one of the things that you said that really stuck with me, Patrick, throughout the lesson was this idea that closing is something you do throughout the entire sales process and not just at the end of it. Can you explain what it is that you're thinking or why you said that and why you think that that's an important mindset to go through the sales process with?
Yeah, I think in most things in life, people like to silo everything away. And then in the sales process, you're thinking, this is where I do discovery. This is where I do a demo and pitch. And this is where I close. And that's where I feel like people really miss out on opportunities to do everything everywhere. Some people say you should always be doing discovery. I also say that you should always be closing. I think that's important because you need to be driving towards some sort of outcome. When people hear that, they typically think, you should be like Glenn Rossing it all the time trying to get credit cards. That's not what I mean. We're going to talk about trial closing a little bit later. What I mean is that you're setting some sort of outcome, whether that be I'm booking a demo, I think it's called, I'm scheduling a proposal review, or I'm figuring out how we need to get to your buyer persona. We're doing all of that at the end, and we're setting the expectation up front. And sometimes I even give the agenda of the next call at the end of the current, just make sure we're always going towards something. That's what I mean by closing.
Gotcha. I love that. It's taking pretty much every step in the sales process and thinking about it as optimizing for the close. Love that analogy. Let's jump into the first section of our webinar today, and that is building a business case with metrics throughout the sales process. Now, we know it's no secret that numbers and metrics speak volumes. When it comes to a sales process, Patrick, why is building a business case with metrics so important? And a couple of other questions I have for you to follow up and answer as well on that is, how can and how do salespeople build a business case with metrics? And 2, is that something salespeople should be doing? And if so, how do they actually get started with that?
I'll answer that right away. Yes, they should be doing it right now. I think that people tend to take the emotional side of sales and logical side and say, I'm good at one of these, I don't really do the other thing. But that's not how human beings work. Everybody is both logical and emotional, and you should be doing both at all times. I think people are generally getting better because of Chris Voss's mental kung fu about the emotional side, but we're not really seeing as much on the logical side. So what I'm talking about here is building a business case with metrics early on. The easiest way to do it, in my opinion, is to get their opinion on what you can do for them while concurrently talking about a story where you've done something similar and you have some sort of metric. I personally don't believe in ROI calculators very much. I think the easiest way to do it is to say, all right, your close rate's at 20%. Typically, we get people to about 25%. I'm not even going to go there. Do you think we can help you close one more deal? I would say, we're actually about 0.5%. And then I would go up until they say, no, that's crazy. I don't think you can do that. And then we have some sort of business case there, right? So later when I go on and I show them why they're investing X thousand amount of dollars, it's because we're going to help you close this many more deals at this deal value.
Now, you said something interesting there that I definitely want to touch on and scratch the surface on a little bit more, and that is not liking ROI calculators. Let's talk about that a little bit and ask, in the case of using an ROI calculator, is there a specific time that is the right time to use an ROI calculator? And should SDRs be using them? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think when we talk about the emotional and logical side, an ROI calculator is actually more emotional. Because a spreadsheet is never going to tell me how much money you're actually going to make me. I won't know that until I'm actually in your service or your product and using it for many years. That's when I'll know how much it's making me. I find it to be very effective as a top of funnel, either on the website like you guys do or with an SDR, just to give people an idea of like, hey, this is what you could see with us potentially. Is that exciting? Does that want to push you towards that top?
Awesome. And then I do want to say or ask, in the case that sales reps are using an ROI calculator, what happens if they've done this research beforehand and they're ready to present this ROI to the prospect? What happens in the case that a prospect objects or rejects that ROI? What is a sales rep to do in that particular instance if the prospect comes back and says, that's great seeing all this information, but yeah, I think this is not interesting.
Yeah, I try to build my process around almost provoking it or trying to tip it out. I call it tipping the bucket. And I use negative reverse selling from Sandler. What that means is I just use negative language when I'm asking a check-in question. Most people would say, like, does that make sense? But I would say something like, here's the ROI we're looking at. I'm assuming you're going to say that's ridiculous and it wouldn't work. And you go in for the negative. So I'm almost hoping that they give me that so we can talk about it and talk about what is reasonable. Because today that's not an objection, it's just they disagree. So, okay, let's have a conversation about that. Where do you think we'll get you? Are we going to make it any worse? Are you going to be closing less? And then start building back up and figuring out what they think is, and then agreeing on that and presenting everything.
Awesome. Can you touch on, you mentioned something earlier, a couple seconds ago actually, that what is this, pitching this ROI calculator to the prospect, what does that look like? So you're on a call, you're going through this conversation. Can you walk us through maybe some of the language you're using or how you're a salesperson, you understand what this is going to sound like. Can you give us a few tips or indications of what this conversation would potentially look like?
Yeah, a common mistake I see is that people ask the questions for their inputs. Like, for example, they need the close rate, they need the average deal size. They ask that during the conversation where they're presenting the ROI calculator, which makes it choppy and weird. I find getting it ahead of time is really effective. So I've seen some sales teams use a form, like a Google form. They just ask those questions ahead of time and it just goes right into their CRM. They have it for later reference and then they can build it together. Or you can ask it on the discovery call. But essentially what I would have done is if I know how to present the ROI calculator is I've already entered in all the metrics and I have the end result, but I'm doing it with them. I'm saying, hey, I'm taking this number, I'm putting it in this cell, I'm taking this number, putting it in this cell. This is what you're going to be seeing as a return. And again, going back to the negative reverse, does that seem ridiculous to you? What would that do if we were able to get it? What kind of impact would that have on your business? Do you see how this would get you to X future state that we talked about? And use it as a conversation piece, not really just like, here's some numbers, have fun with it.
Yeah.
Because you want to do the analysis with them and not just give it to them.
Perfect. I love that. Let's move on to the second section, and that's confirming your champion. So as I mentioned, this was a personal favorite of mine. This is something we cover extensively in that How to Close the Sale lesson on HubSpot Academy, which, as I mentioned, everyone, you can find a link to that in the description below. This is something both you and Jim mention quite frequently throughout the lesson. And for those of us who don't know or aren't familiar with the term champion, can you walk us through what a champion is and why this champion is a critical part of the sales process?
A champion is like the beautiful quote of you within another organization.
Yeah.
Hopefully sell your vision to everyone internally that does not want to talk to you at all.
Awesome.
And I think the most important thing that I've seen in the shift from how we used to sell directly to decision makers to selling to champions is that people typically try to sell the same way. They're trying to go off impulse, where I cannot close a champion on impulse. Like if I'm in a store and I'm going to buy a bag, that's impulse, right? Oh, I'm really excited about this. I'm just going to pull the trigger. They can't pull the trigger. So this has to be more of a strategic sell, where you're building along a timeline with them, giving them the ammo they need to sell, and making them excited to actually do what you do and become an internal salesman.
Yeah, that's really great. And what is this? I know you guys use the term champion confirmed at PandaDoc quite a bit, but what does this question actually look like? You have your prospect on their phone. What is the language you're using at PandaDoc to say, to kind of confirm, hey, this is who my champion is?
Yeah, the exact language is, are you ready to recommend that your business purchase PandaDoc? There's a couple keywords there. Purchase is really important. It doesn't work if you say, do you think PandaDoc would be a good fit for your company? You need to get money involved. But that's also part of what makes it tricky, because people hear purchase and their ears perk up, and they kind of have the demo coma that you might have put them in, and they're very alert, and they're like, oh crap, like I gotta actually talk about money? That's not good. So this is a good opportunity to see where they are in the sales cycle, to figure out if you're aligned with what they actually need next.
What are some of the typical responses? So you've asked this question, hey, are you ready to recommend that your company purchase HubSpot or purchase PandaDoc, whatever your product is? What are some of the expectations you can set for yourself as a sales rep, that some responses that you may see or hear from that question?
Yeah, first of all, don't feel bad if people freak out. Every time I ask this, there's a subsection of people that are always just gonna not hear the entire sentence. They just hear purchase PandaDoc and they go, oh, I can't do that. I don't have the authority to purchase this. I'm just talking to my boss. And you just have to calm them down and go, hey, I get that. That's not what I'm asking. I'll just ask again. So if the question is, are you ready to recommend that your company purchase PandaDoc? I'm asking for you to sell this in turn. Just like explaining even sometimes why I'm asking helps a lot.
Yeah, I like that. And I love the distinction and emphasis that you do place on this idea that it's not a purchasing question. You're not asking someone if they're ready to purchase. You're just asking them if they're ready to, advocate in a room of stakeholders when you're not present or you're not on the call. And I think there's an important distinction to make to the prospect as well, and actually communicate that when you're asking this question, is that, hey, we're not asking you if you want to buy that product today. We're just asking you, are you ready to recommend that your company purchase this product, and list a few reasons why. So I really like that distinction, and something I think a lot of sales reps should emphasize is that recommendation keyword, and that it's not a purchasing question. Let's move on to the final-ish section, and that is one that I know is going to be really popular, and that is using time-based incentives. We know that this is a hot topic. I'm really excited personally to hear your thoughts on this, Patrick, but let's actually start with the absolute fundamentals. So for those of us who don't know, and even for those of us who do, give us a reminder of what is a time-based incentive actually?
A time-based incentive is for the seller a way to control forecast accuracy and timing of the deal closing. And for the buyer, it's an incentive to change the way that they do business and approve deals to get a better deal on the price.
Awesome. And how do you find, or what are some of the common ways that salespeople use time-based incentives in the sales process? Do you have some best practices that people should keep in mind?
Yeah, I think in a vacuum, it's a terrible idea.
Yeah.
Like if you were to just listen to this webinar and go, oh, I should tell people to sign by a certain date, that's amazing, I can imagine, thank you. I would say, no, dear viewers, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is a time-based incentive really helps you, once you've actually closed the deal in their head, it helps you control when it actually is signed. Because as we know in B2B sales, oftentimes the person agreeing to sign something and the signing actually happening can sometimes be weeks apart. And that delay can sometimes kill the deal because something random can come in and just explode that wouldn't have happened otherwise, or it could just make the person who runs the books upset. So it's a way for you to figure out when the deal is actually going to come in. It's not a way to close it. The closing is done on the champion confirm question. The closing is done on how you demo. The closing is done on how you discover. And then the TBI, the time-based incentive, is how you just make sure that it's signed at a specific.
Perfect. I have a couple more questions on the time-based incentive section. And the first one I know as well is a popular and very common question too. And that is, does a TBI or time-based incentive devalue the solution that you're offering?
That is a good question, because in some cases I think it can. And the reason is because someone will say, I think your product isn't worth this amount, or I'm buying a competitor and they only charge this. And the salesperson says, well, I can give you that price if you sign by this date.
Yeah. Which
I don't even count as a time-based incentive. To me, that's just an excuse for lowering your price. A time-based incentive should be, I'm in control of what I'm giving them, and what I'm giving them is something to help them feel good about our partnership. That's not to give them a reason to sign. So I think like it would devalue your product if you just didn't really show them why they need it. You didn't try to close them. They have no idea why they would really use your product. And then you just try to give them the lowest price possible to get it. That would devalue the product, so don't do that.
Perfect. And then the next question I have, and this is essentially a twofold question. We'll probably lean on the second part of the question a little bit more, but is when it comes to time-based incentives, how much discount should a sales rep or company be thinking about? And how long should the time-based incentive be? Now, I know for the first part of the question, it's really going to depend on the nature of the product and how complex it is or what tier it is and all that kind of stuff, that the discount levels will vary. So we can maybe skip that part because every person's sales process is unique and everybody's product is unique. But what is a good indication of how long a sales rep or salesperson should give their prospect to capitalize on this time-based incentive? Is there a rule of thumb doing that?
Yeah, just to touch on the first part of the question, I would say, while I can't give you an exact number, I would say something that's really helped our team is determining like a percentage you're willing to give per unit. So for example, we use seats, like a lot of SaaS companies, as a unit. So it's a quarter of a percentage per seat is what I feel comfortable with, up to a certain percentage. And then you can give that to the rep to say, this is what you can do. This is what you can offer. Anything past that, you have to go to your next time. So I find setting some sort of threshold really helps. And then on the question of like actually using it as a time, I'd say specifically, you should never have a rule of thumb on this, because if I always say it's going to be 3 days that I give somebody for a time-based incentive, I'm going to probably piss off a lot of people and make people angry, and it's not going to be good, right? Because they're going to say, I need to go to my boss, I need to go to the board, I need to talk to my dog first, and none of that can be done within that time frame. So you're going to end up alienating people. What you should be doing is asking somebody up front what they're comfortable with or what can work. So before I even talk about it, I say, hey, I have another option available, but I'm hesitant to bring it up because it will require time-based commitment. And then I just pause, and then they give me, maybe I can do that. Well, what do you mean time-based commitment? I say, well, typically it would mean that you would need to sign by a certain date, and then I tell my time-based incentive story, which would be something like, a finance team met with the sales team, and they said they were just going crazy on discounts. We need to calm down on it. So we said we can't win deals without some level of discounting because there are other vendors that are doing the same thing, and in that case, we need a reason. So they said, okay, well, if you can control when the deal comes in and we can make our books look good, we're willing to give you a certain percentage. So that's why I'm telling you this today. What would be a reasonable time frame for us to get this done by?
Yeah.
And then I get them to give it to me. And then once that's done, I say, okay, great. That'll be the date. And then I go through with the consent eventually.
I loved what you mentioned about, giving that, being flexible with that time frame, because one of the things that I find, and this is what I've heard, we talk about this in the lesson as well, is this idea of we don't want to push a prospect to close. Like, we don't want to force them to get to a point and compromise the comfortability they're having in the buying process. And I think sometimes that's what people can feel, or why people are hesitant to use time-based incentives, because they don't want to put any pressure on the prospect to purchase. They don't want to feel like they're forcing the prospect to close. And I think one of the things that you mentioned there, a really good key was, you mentioned like, hey, I'm hesitant to bring up this other option. We do have it, but it's going to require a specific time frame, right? And then you kind of give the prospect the opportunity to say, well, what is this time frame? And is this something we could probably meet? And you kind of put the ball in their court to then say, hey, here's the framework, here's what we have available, here's what we can do, here's the time it requires, are you able to commit to that? Versus saying, hey, we can offer you it at this price, but you have to sign by this day. It just doesn't feel as much as the prospect, so to say, is in control. I have a few more questions before we wrap. And that's, I'm going to hop back to some of the other sections that we had. And I want to go back to, and I know that you mentioned you don't necessarily always like these, but I want to go back to the ROI calculator and really building this business case with metrics. As far as the ROI calculator, I think I may know what your answer is here already, but do you yourself ever skip an ROI calculator or metrics? And why would you do that?
Yeah, I have skipped it before. There have been times I've just straight up skipped the business case. And that's typically when I personally feel like the problem is so emotionally resonant with the person that they're ready to go fight for me, and that the people we're pitching to are not analytically minded. Like, I'm pitching to maybe a sales manager, or I'm pitching to somebody in marketing, where they're not necessarily looking for numbers, they're looking for like, is this gonna help? Where if I was pitching to operations or financial, I'm never gonna skip it. It's always gonna be something I go through, but sometimes it can introduce tension, I feel like, where you don't want it. And I try to avoid that.
The next question, and this is the last one before we wrap, and this is back on the confirming your champion. And I know that this is a common question as well, and that is, based on the analogy that you've given and the definition that you've given for what a champion is, and this is somebody who's going to go and advocate for you, there's also this idea of a term that a lot of salespeople are familiar with, and that is the decision maker, the people who ultimately have the authority to make a decision on purchasing. Can those two, the champion and the decision maker, be the same person? Are they ever the same person, or is it the case that they're almost always different? And if they are the same person, does confirming your champion look a little bit differently, or does that change the process whatsoever?
Yeah, I think people tend to think about everything as being on one line, where I see it as two separate lines that are going to the same place. So on one side, I have the internal buying process of the prospect. On the other side, I have the external selling process of me and my team. I'm like, I'm trying to get them somewhere and they're trying to go somewhere, right? So I think specifically, people confuse those. We need to think about it as like, for me, they're a champion, but for them, they're making the decision, right? They have to maybe go to a signatory who might be the CFO, or there's budget locked up, but they're ultimately just going to say, hey, I need the budget, I need to sign, and they're making the decision. So in that case, the champion and the decision maker can be the same person, but I think you need to be really careful about changing the language. Because if you do, then it's like, hey, are you ready to purchase PandaDoc? They still can't necessarily do it even though they make the decision. So I would keep the language pretty much exactly the same, and then just adjust what the steps are after you ask the question.
Gotcha. I like that. As much as I like to continue picking your brain, I know that we probably have a ton of other questions that we could cover in this as well. but I do want to be respectful of your time. And if anybody wants to learn a lot more about what it is that we covered here today, we do cover a lot of this information, and Patrick and his colleague Jim go over some of this information in that How to Close a Sale lesson, which you can find a link in the description below. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more about that, head over to HubSpot Academy. We have that lesson packed with resources. We have an ebook that we've worked together with PandaDoc on that touches on some of these topics as well. As much as we'd like to continue the conversation, we do have to bring it to an end. Patrick, is there anything you'd like to sign off with? Where can people find you? What's kind of happening in yours and PandaDoc's world?
Yeah, LinkedIn I'm most active on. You can find me as Patrick D there. As far as PandaDoc goes, I'm featured on a lot of their content. So if you go to our content page, webinars, ebooks, you can check everything out there. And that's about it. I'm just going to get dinner with the roadies in the pan.
Awesome. Love the get up today. Patrick, thanks for joining us. Thanks so much for all your knowledge and thought that you brought to this. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about this, make sure you go and check out that How to Close a Sale lesson on Academy. Thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll see you soon. Bye now.
Bye-bye.